Allie Mans.
And I'm Sarah Middlebrook.
And we are streaming our live podcast, China, a Nation of Only Children, here in smoggy Beijing. We are going to be discussing the one-child policy today. The one-child policy was instated because the population of China was rising rapidly. Therefore, the Chinese government sprung into action and made this policy.
This law was instituted by the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party in 1980. This policy stated that Chinese couples were only allowed to have one child in order to slow down the growing population.
Though this policy was very strict, there were many exceptions in place.
For example, many minority groups and families that had a disabled child were allowed to have more than one kid.
However, in city environments, the population consisted of families who were very willing to follow this policy because of overcrowding.
The Chinese government has encouraged the use of birth control since 1949, but the one-child policy was the first law.
The families that lived in rural settings were more resistant to this policy because they had a tradition of having more children to work the field.
By the 1990s, families had an average of 2 children. Life expectancy increased while death rate decreased, so that leveled off the decrease in children being born. However, the overall rate of population increase declined after the policy.
Male children were preferred over female children because they carried on the family name. Female children were not desirable, which resulted in many abortions after a child's sex was learned.
There was a big divide between females and males, and there were a lot more men than women. This meant that there were less women available for marriage as well.
Some families that had a second child had to keep them undocumented. This meant they could not get a job or be educated.
To show that they were not pregnant, women had to prove that they were menstruating on a napkin that they had to show to their supervisor.
If a second child was found to be hiding illegally, the parents of the child would be punished, not the child. Some people, to avoid the punishment, would smother their babies and throw them in the trash. Crazy incidences!
One extreme example of the seriousness of this policy is the Iron Fist campaign. Launched in April 2010, this act targeted around 10,000 women who had more than one child. Over 600 officials were ordered to raid the households of these families and take the family members of those who had disobeyed the one-child policy.
They did not just take the extra child, they took grandparents, teenagers, infants, and siblings. They were then placed in jail until the women who had broke the law got surgery to become sterile. The particular area where this crackdown occurred had an increase in children being born because the economy in that area was booming.
The jails that the family members were held in had horrible conditions. The cells were crowded, damp, and there was only enough room to stand. There were no blankets or food provided to the prisoners.
Some people that got sterilized because of the Iron Fist campaign even stated that they had felt blackmailed into that situation. Some fines that were given out were 6 times the couple's annual income. Crazy incidences out!
In modern times, the United States is of the opinion that China has started to loosen the policy, especially in cities where birth rates have dropped dramatically over the past decades.
This is not true, though. The Chinese government has denied relaxing the law nationally.
In 2013, the law was changed so that families in which parents were an only child were allowed to have 2 kids.
Incidentally, the value of girls and women increased because of this policy. Girls are now born into a family that holds no bias because if they did, the girl would have been aborted. It is estimated that 30 million Chinese men will go unmarried because of the gap between the genders.
It is hard to tell if the one-child policy overall has helped China, with both pros and cons on each side of the story.
See you next time on our podcast. Thanks for listening.